The wind erased the valley first. Crow's Fork Basin vanished behind moving white. Snow did not fall. It moved sideways. Hard, fast, relentless. Cabins across the basin fought to stay warm. Fireplaces roared. Woodpiles shrank. Men fed flames every hour. Still, the cold kept entering. One cabin looked ordinary from the outside. Rough pine logs. A paper-sealed window. Smoke climbed into a sky no one could see. Nothing about it seemed different. Inside, the warmth came from the wrong direction. A thin, rectangular seam marked the center of the floor. From that seam rose a dim amber glow. Heat followed it upward. Slow, even, untroubled. Neighbors had mocked it for months. They called it Kern's Burrow. They said the builder had lost his judgment after burying his wife. No proper settler lived under his own house. Tonight, 16 people depended on it. They gathered beneath the floorboards in a brick-lined chamber. No speeches, no heroics, just steady breathing and steady air. A small iron stove burned one split log. The man beside the hatch was Jonah Kearns, a quiet homesteader who once repaired wagon wheels for freight teams. He spoke little. He listened to the storm. For more than 60 hours, the wind had not rested. It did not rise and fall. It stayed a long, steady roar pressing against the walls like weight. Above them, the cabin groaned. Frost traced the window frame. Loose snow struck the siding in sharp bursts. Below, the air stayed calm and warm. Jonah checked the latch. He listened to the chimney draw. Then he waited. 5 more days, by his estimate. Then a heavy knock struck the door. Jonah lifted the bar and opened it into the wind. A figure collapsed across the threshold. The storm was not yet at its worst. Jonah knew that before anyone else did. If frontier survival, forgotten engineering, or real stories of human grit move you, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This is the kind of story that isn't legend, it's learned under wind and snow, where every lesson counts. The storm outside was not the first winter Jonah Kearns had faced. It was, however, the first he believed he understood. The year before, February of 1856, the cold had come quickly, not a gradual season, but a hard drop in 2 days. The creek froze solid. Even the axe handles stung bare hands. Jonah's cabin had been built the proper way. He cut straight pine logs from the ridge above the basin, each log notched tight at the corners. The gaps were packed with mud and moss. The roof was sound. The door fit well. The window was sealed with oiled paper to block drafts. No settler who saw it would have called it careless work. Inside, the fireplace burned constantly. Jonah fed it before sleep, before dawn, and through the day. He split wood until his shoulders trembled. The fire answered every effort. Still, the warmth did not stay. Heat climbed upward as soon as it formed. It gathered near the rafters, then disappeared into the chimney. The floor remained cold underfoot. The packed earth beneath the cabin held winter inside it. His wife, Martha Kearns, stayed near the hearth wrapped in blankets. She was not weak by nature. She worked garden rows and hauled water like any homesteader's wife. But that winter she had been fighting a lingering cough. On the second night, the woodpile looked smaller than it should. By the third day, Jonah understood the truth. The fire was not heating the house. It was heating the sky. He burned faster. He cut faster. He carried armloads in until his gloves froze stiff with sweat. The cabin stayed cold beyond the circle of the flames. On the 4th morning, the last split log went into the hearth. Without fuel, the room temperature fell quickly. Frost formed along the inside wall planks. Their breath showed in pale clouds. The bed never warmed. Martha could not keep her body heat. Blankets held nothing. The air itself drew warmth away from her. Before sunrise, she grew still. Jonah sat beside her for a long time after. The cabin stood intact around him. The workmanship had not failed. The design had. Every part of the house had followed, accepted frontier practice. And still, it had not protected the person it was meant to shelter. The problem was not how he built. It was what he had built. The cold had not forced its way through the walls. It had risen from the ground and escaped through the roof. The fire fought only the symptoms. The winter, owned the structure. That was the day Jonah stopped trusting tradition alone. Jonah buried Martha on the low hillside above the cabin. The ground was hard enough that he used an iron bar more than a shovel. When the work was finished, the valley was quiet again. The house remained exactly as he had built it. For several days, he changed nothing. He repaired tools. He stacked unused lumber, but his attention never left the cabin. He studied the fireplace first, then the door seams, then the packed earth floor. Nothing appeared broken. That troubled him more than failure would have. Years earlier, before homesteading, Jonah had worked in street, Louis as a wheelwright, a man who built and repaired wagon wheels for freight teams crossing the territories. He knew wood. He knew joints. He knew small errors rarely looked dramatic. A wagon wheel did not shatter because of poor lumber. It failed because of stress placed in the wrong direction. A tiny gap, no wider than a coin, could shift weight off balance and break a full axle miles down the trail. Standing in his cabin, he saw the same problem. The logs were solid. The chinking was tight, yet the heat did not stay. He noticed where warmth gathered, near the rafters, not the floor. He noticed where the cold remained, at his boots, not the ceiling. The fire was working, but the structure was not guiding it. Jonah stopped asking how to build a warmer cabin. He began asking a different question. How did cold actually move? Not where it came from, not how it felt, but where it traveled once it arrived. He watched his breath drift upward. He placed a hand on the dirt floor and felt steady chill beneath the boards. The cabin was not leaking heat sideways. It was losing it vertically. For the first time, he considered that winter was not an enemy at the door. It was a force moving through the house itself, and a house built above the ground might be fighting in the wrong place entirely. Spring came late to Crow's Fork Basin. The snow receded slowly, leaving gray patches of frozen ground. Travel became possible again. Several homesteaders began preparing to leave. Jonah considered doing the same. He owned a good mule and a serviceable wagon. He could return east, find work again repairing freight wheels, and pass winter in a town with walls thicker than logs. No one would have judged him for it. He packed tools into a crate. He set aside what he could carry. The rest he planned to sell. The evening before departure, he entered the cabin one last time. The fireplace held only cold ash. The iron poker leaned where he had left it weeks before. No smoke marked the chimney. The house was silent. He walked across the dirt floor. It felt the same as the morning Martha died. Not broken, not damaged. Everything stood as a proper frontier cabin should stand. Tight corners, solid roof, well-sealed door. Any neighbor would have called it a good structure, and still it had failed its purpose. Jonah stood in the center of the room a long time. He understood then that leaving would solve nothing. He would only be escaping one winter, not the truth behind it. Another family would someday build a similar cabin. Another fire would burn through a similar woodpile. Another morning would come just as cold. He was not braver than other men. He simply could not accept repeating a mistake he now recognized. So he unpacked the crate. He put the tools back on their pegs. He led the mule back into its shelter. Jonah Kearns stayed in Crow's Fork Basin, not out of stubbornness, and not out of grief alone. He stayed because the problem remained unsolved. After deciding to remain, Jonah Kearns began riding the basin trails again. He did not announce a project. He carried no plans. He simply started visiting neighbors. He asked ordinary questions. How had their winter gone? What had frozen? What had not? At Thomas Rigg's farm, a vegetable grower whose root crops fed several homesteads, Jonah noticed a door set into a low hillside. Rigg called it a storage cellar. It was dug deep and roofed with timber and earth. Snow covered the slope outside. The ground above was hard as iron, but inside the cellar the soil felt damp and workable. Water barrels had not frozen. Potatoes lay uncovered in wooden bins. Jonah pressed his hand to the earthen wall. It was not warm, but it was not cold. Rigg shrugged at his curiosity. He said the ground held steady. He had never thought much about why. Weeks later, Jonah rode toward Slate Gulch, where a small group of miners worked a narrow lead vein in the hills. They allowed him to descend with them. At the entrance, breath fogged the air. 20 feet down the passage the air changed. 40 feet down it grew almost comfortable. The men worked in shirt sleeves despite snow above. They pointed to their oil lamps and said the flames heated the tunnel. Jonah nodded but did not argue. A few small lamps could not warm an entire hillside. The temperature did not fluctuate. It held steady. The deeper they went, the more constant it felt. The mountain itself was providing something the open air could not. Farther north, he visited a Norwegian family living in a sod-backed cabin. Half their home rested against packed earth. Their fire burned low. They used less wood than any household he knew. The back wall never iced over. The children slept without coats. The father explained that in his homeland, many houses leaned into hillsides. Wind passed over them instead of through them. The ground did most of the work. The final visit took him along the creek where a Métis trapper, Luc Street Orme, wintered each year. Luc lived in a dugout cut into the bank. From a distance, it barely looked like a dwelling. Inside, the air was still. No draft reached the sleeping area. A small fire pit smoldered with little fuel. Jonah studied the low roof and packed earth walls. Luc noticed his attention and spoke plainly. "Cabins fight the wind," he said. "Wind wins, every time." He tapped the dirt wall beside him. "Ja jit người, dut thi không." Jonah sat there for a long while. Each place he had visited differed in design. Each belonged to a different trade and culture. Yet the same condition repeated. Where walls met open air, winter entered. Where walls met earth, winter slowed. He began to see the pattern clearly. Wood kept rain out. Fire fought cold briefly. But the earth itself resisted temperature change. The cabin had not failed because it was poorly made. It failed because it stood entirely above ground. For the first time since Martha's death, Jonah did not feel confused. He felt certain. The answer would not be found by improving the fireplace. It would be found by changing where a man chose to live during a storm. Jonah returned to his cabin with a different kind of purpose. He no longer walked the room searching for faults. He walked it measuring distance. The center of the floor held his attention. If the earth kept temperature steady, then the safest place during a blizzard would not be beside the fireplace. It would be below the house itself, not a cellar for food. A refuge for people. He cleared a section of planks and marked a rectangle with charcoal. He paced it carefully, large enough for several occupants, small enough for one man to construct alone. The chamber would be 12 feet below the floor, roughly 11 feet by 16, deep enough to escape surface cold, wide enough to shelter neighbors if needed. The walls could not be bare soil. Loose earth would collapse. He planned brick lining set in lime mortar to hold shape and dryness. Above it, he would place heavy timber beams to carry the weight of the cabin. The room below would not weaken the structure. The house would stand exactly as before. From outside, nothing would appear altered. Access mattered. He designed a stairway rather than a ladder, so exhausted or injured people could descend safely. The opening in the floor would close with a tight wooden hatch. The boards would fit flush to stop drafts. Airflow required equal care. He studied his stone chimney and realized it could hide a second passage. One flue would serve the fireplace above. A separate, narrow flue would draw fresh air to the chamber below. The draft would rise naturally with heat. No bellows. No moving parts. Only pressure and temperature doing the work. For heat, he planned a small cast-iron parlor stove. It would not need to warm a whole cabin. Only a confined, insulated space. A single log could last hours. Jonah understood the room would not replace the house. Daily life would still occur above ground. The chamber existed for one purpose alone. When the storm made the surface dangerous, people would go down and wait. He redrew the plan several times, until every step felt certain. By the end, he held no invention, only an arrangement of known principles placed correctly together. For the first time since winter, he trusted what he intended to build. Plans alone did not build anything on the frontier. Jonah Kearns needed materials he could not make himself, so he rode to the trading post at the edge of the basin. Pruitt's Supply served as store, mail stop, and gathering place for passing freight teams. Its owner, Silas Pruitt, was a practical man who sold tools, nails, flour, and advice in equal measure. He knew every homestead within a day's ride. He also knew when an idea sounded expensive. Jonah laid a folded paper across the counter. It held a careful list written in block letters: brick, lime, tarred felt, extra iron hinges, stovepipe, small parlor stove. Silas read it twice before speaking. "You building a second house?" he asked. Jonah answered plainly. "A room under the first." Silas did not laugh. He leaned his elbows on the counter and asked questions instead. How would water drain from a pit that deep? What would hold the earth back during spring thaw? If the beams failed, would the cabin settle? Jonah explained the brick lining and lime mortar. He described a gravel sump at the lowest point. He spoke of heavy crossbeams carrying the floor weight. Silas listened without interruption. When Jonah finished, the storekeeper nodded once. "It might stand," he said. Then he tapped the list with a finger. "It will cost you near everything you saved." The total exceeded a season's profit from wheel repairs and small crops. Jonah knew that already. He slid his coin purse across the counter. Silas counted carefully. He left only a few dollars in change. He handed the purse back and spoke more quietly. "Folks will talk. They won't understand a hole under a sound house." Jonah took the materials receipt. "I'm not building it for talk," he said. Silas studied him a moment longer. "They'll call you foolish," he added. "Maybe worse." Jonah gave a small nod. "That doesn't change winter." Neither man said more. Outside, freight wagons rattled past on the hard road. Inside, the cost of the project was settled. Jonah left the store with less money, a wagon of supplies, and a reputation already beginning to change. The work began the next morning. Jonah removed the floorboards in the marked rectangle and stacked them carefully against the wall. Beneath them lay packed earth, firm from years of weight. He drove a shovel into it. The ground resisted. He worked alone, no hired hands, no neighbors volunteering help for a project they did not believe in. The first inches came slowly. He filled a bucket, tied a rope to the handle, and hauled it upward. Each load climbed through the opening and spilled onto a growing mound outside the cabin. Hour after hour, the pattern repeated. Dig, fill, lift, dump. The sound of the shovel striking soil replaced the sound of the wind. As the pit deepened, the labor changed. The bucket grew heavier. The rope cut into his gloves. His shoulders burned from lifting above his head. By the third day, the hole was deeper than his height. Light reached the bottom only as a narrow shaft. Air felt cooler but calmer. He cut footholds into one wall to climb out. Then he built a temporary ladder from scrap boards when the climb grew unsafe. Every movement required caution now. At 6 feet, the earth began to loosen along one side. Fine soil trickled down the wall. He stopped digging immediately. Jonah braced the section with planks set crosswise and hammered support posts beneath them. The collapse never came, but the warning remained clear. The ground demanded respect. He adjusted his pace after that. No hurried shoveling, no careless strikes. Each layer removed only after the last was secure. By the time he reached 12 feet, the pile outside the cabin stood as high as the window ledge. Nearly 18,000 pounds of earth had been lifted by rope and arm alone. No one in the basin could ignore the effort now. Passers-by slowed their horses to stare. They saw a man climbing out of a hole in his own floor, covered in dust and sweat. Jonah said little to them. He returned to the pit and kept working. The chamber was not yet built, but the weight of it was already real. By the second week, nearly everyone in Crow's Fork Basin had heard about the excavation. Some rode past to see it for themselves. Most only talked about it at the post. One man chose to stop. Caleb Mercer, a neighboring homesteader who raised corn and cut timber for winter fuel, tied his horse outside Jonah's cabin and walked to the doorway. He stood a moment, studying the opening in the floor. Then he called down into it. Jonah climbed up the ladder and stepped onto the boards. Dust covered his coat and gloves. He waited without greeting. Caleb shook his head slowly. "You've dug near half a cellar," he said. "Planting season is weeks away. That time won't come back." Jonah said nothing. Caleb walked the edge of the opening, careful not to step too close. You could put this labor into fencing, he continued, or a second shed. Something that feeds you. Jonah wiped soil from the shovel blade and leaned it against the wall. Caleb hesitated before speaking again. His tone softened, though his meaning did not. After what happened to Martha, he said, folks would understand wanting to leave, but digging under the house, that won't change last winter. The room grew quiet. Jonah stopped moving. For a moment he looked at the floorboards, rather than at Caleb. Then he answered in a steady voice, I'm not changing last winter. He met the other man's eyes. I'm building something that will keep people alive in the next one. Caleb did not reply immediately. He was not mocking now. He was measuring whether the statement held sense. He glanced once more into the dark pit. From below rose only cool, still air. You truly think this hole will stop a blizzard? He asked. Jonah picked up the shovel again. No, he said. It won't stop the storm. He paused. It will outlast it. Neither man spoke after that. Caleb placed his hat back on and walked to his horse. He left without further argument, but not without doubt. Behind him, the sound of digging resumed, slow and steady as before. Digging alone had been difficult. Building would prove harder. Jonah began lining the chamber walls with brick. He mixed lime mortar in a shallow trough beside the cabin. At first, the joints would not hold. Some bricks shifted as the mortar dried. Others loosened when he pressed the next row into place. By the end of the first day, a section bowed inward and had to be taken down. He rebuilt it the following morning with the same result. The bricks were sound. The problem was his method. Wheelwright skills did not automatically make a mason. On the third afternoon, a wagon stopped along the road. Its driver, Hendrik Voss, a traveling stonemason who repaired chimneys and well linings for frontier settlements, noticed the stacked brick outside the cabin and walked over. He climbed down into the pit without ceremony. He examined the mortar with his thumb and nodded once. Too wet, he said simply. Jonah offered payment he could scarcely spare. Hendrik refused coin but accepted a hot meal and a place to rest for the night. Before dusk, he showed the proper mixture. More sand, less water. Lime worked until it held shape without slumping. He demonstrated how to butter the brick edges and press each piece firmly against the last. He set a plumb line from the ceiling beam so the wall would rise straight, every course aligned with the one below it. Jonah repeated the process under Hendrik's watch. The first row held. The second row held. By morning, the wall stood firm enough to lean against without shifting. No gaps opened. No bricks slipped. Hendrik left the next day and continued down the trail. He carried no plans with him. He left only method. After that, the work settled into rhythm. Mix. Set. Align. Each row rose slower than digging but stronger. For the first time, the chamber no longer looked like a hole. It looked like a structure meant to endure. Brick and mortar had formed the shell, but a sealed room would soon become a tomb without air. Jonah began to dismantle the base of the old stone chimney. He worked with the meticulous care of a man dissecting a living thing. Alongside the main flue for the upstairs hearth, he skillfully built a second, smaller channel out of fire brick. It ran straight down 12 feet, opening into the cellar. It was an elegant design, built on a simple principle. Cold, heavy air would be drawn down through a cleverly hidden intake vent outside, while the heat from the small iron stove below would push the stale air up and out through the secondary channel. The cellar began to breathe. Next came the stove. Using a block and tackle, Jonah lowered a small, cast-iron parlor stove into the space. He set it in the corner, connecting its pipe to the new flue system. As the first kindling caught fire deep beneath the earth, Jonah sat and watched. No smoke leaked into the room, no suffocating smell, only a gentle, steady warmth that began to seep into the brick walls. Overhead, the floorboards were now supported by massive pine beams, strong enough to bear the weight of a freight wagon, if need be. He fitted the hatch, a heavy lid of solid oak. Along its edges, he fastened strips of tarred felt. When closed, the material compressed tight against the frame. No draft passed through the seam. From a few steps away, the opening nearly vanished. Jonah climbed the ladder and closed the hatch. He stood in the center of the empty cabin above. From the tight seam in the floorboards, a sliver of amber light bled upward. He laid his palm flat against the wood. It was no longer deathly cold, as it had been last winter. It was warm, breathing with life from below. Outside, the sky over Crow's Fork Basin was turning to lead. The wind was changing its tune, its whisper rising to a long shriek through the pines. Winter was returning. But this time, Jonah didn't look to the window in fear. He knelt, touching the warm floorboards, and for the first time in a year, he exhaled. Kern's burrow was ready. The shelter did not depend on constant effort. It depended on design. By autumn, the work was finished. The cabin looked unchanged from the road. No extra walls, no added roof, only the same small homestead standing in the grass. Word spread anyway. At Pruitt's Supply, the trading post where settlers gathered for mail and provisions, the project became a common subject of talk. Men spoke about weather, harvests, and freight schedules. Sooner or later, they spoke about the hole beneath Jonah Kearns's floor. Jonah entered one afternoon to purchase lamp oil. Conversation quieted briefly, then resumed. Caleb Mercer leaned against a barrel and smiled without malice. "So the badger's den is finished," he said. A few men chuckled. Another asked if Jonah planned to winter underground like a miner. Someone else wondered whether snow would bury the door before he reached it. The laughter was not cruel. It was practical disbelief. Jonah paid for the oil and prepared to leave. Near the counter, Eleanor Mercer, Caleb's wife, watched him with concern rather than humor. She said nothing, but her expression held uncertainty instead of ridicule. As Jonah turned toward the door, Silas Pruitt spoke quietly so only he could hear. "You may never need it," the storekeeper said. "Winters pass mild some years." Jonah nodded once. "That would be best," he answered. Silas studied him. "You built it anyway." Jonah opened the door. "Preparation doesn't wait for permission," he said. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the grass. Inside, a few men laughed again after he left. No one argued with him. No one agreed with him. They simply did not believe the problem he prepared for would truly come. Winter did not announce itself gently that year. In early December, the temperature dropped within hours. Clouds thickened. By nightfall, the wind began. By morning, it no longer stopped. Snow drove sideways across Crow's Fork Basin. Fences vanished first, then wagon tracks, then the road itself. Cabins sealed their doors. Chimneys smoked heavily. Axes rang in wood piles as men split fuel as fast as they could lift it. The storm deepened anyway. Jonah watched from his window until visibility failed completely. The air outside moved like smoke. The horizon disappeared. He barred the door and prepared. Inside, the fireplace burned high. For a few hours the room warmed. Then the same pattern returned. Heat rose toward the rafters. Cold crept along the floorboards. Drafts pressed through seams no chinking could fully block. The cabin was behaving exactly as before. By the second night, frost formed along the interior wall planks. Water in a basin began to ice. The fire consumed wood faster than expected. Jonah did not increase the flames. He opened the hatch. A soft current of warmer air drifted upward from below. Not hot, not smoky, steady. He carried a lantern down the steps and closed the hatch above him. The change was immediate. The air below felt still, almost sheltered from weather entirely. The brick walls held the temperature. No drafts reached the room. He placed a single split log in the small stove and lit it. The chamber warmed gradually, then stopped changing. It neither overheated nor cooled. Hours passed. The log settled into glowing coals. The warmth remained. Above, the wind struck the cabin repeatedly. Snow hit the walls in bursts. The chimney howled with pressure. Below, the air held constant. Jonah listened carefully for smoke buildup or failing draft. None appeared. The narrow flue continued pulling air downward and exhaust upward as planned. For the first time, the structure itself carried the burden instead of constant labor. He no longer chased warmth. He kept it. The storm intensified through the night. The cabin shuddered overhead, but the chamber remained calm. The design had met the test he built it for. The proof came the next night. A sudden udar against the door broke through the wind, steady roar. Not a polite knock. A body hitting wood. Jonah climbed the steps and lifted the bar. Snow forced the door inward as he opened it. Caleb Mercer stumbled across the threshold and collapsed to his knees. Behind him stood Eleanor Mercer, wrapped in blankets, stiff with ice. Their faces were pale from cold. Jonah shut the door quickly and set the bar again. He did not ask questions. He did not speak at all. He simply pointed to the hatch. Caleb hesitated only a moment before helping Eleanor descend the steps. Warm air rose around them as they went down. Neither commented. They understood immediately. Within an hour, another pounding came. A ranch hand from the lower pasture arrived with frostbitten fingers. His stove had failed when the chimney iced shut. Then came a widow from the creek road with 2 children wrapped in quilts. Their cabin door had frozen in place. They had walked by lantern light, through blowing snow. Each time Jonah opened the door only long enough to bring them inside. No one lingered above ground. Each new arrival went directly below. The chamber filled slowly. Boots lined the brick wall. Wet coats steamed near the small stove. The room never overheated. The air remained steady. Breathing slowed. No one argued. No one spoke loudly. The storm above them commanded quiet. On the 3rd day, food ran low, but the warmth held. The stove burned small pieces of wood instead of heavy logs. The chamber kept what little heat it was given. Another family reached the cabin at dusk. Guided only by fence posts, they felt through the dark. They descended the steps, shaking with exhaustion. Within minutes, their shivering stopped. By the 4th day, 16 people occupied the space beneath the cabin. They slept in shifts along the brick walls. Children rested first. Adults kept watch near the stove. Above them, the house groaned under drifting snow. The chimney howled at every gust. At times, the wind pressed so hard against the door that the latch strained. Below, the temperature barely changed. No one laughed about the burrow now. No one apologized either. The proof required no words. Caleb sat beside the wall opposite Jonah and studied the ceiling beams overhead. He finally spoke quietly. "You knew," he said. Jonah shook his head once. "I prepared," he answered. The difference mattered. 5 days passed before the wind weakened. The basin reappeared slowly through clearing air. When the hatch finally opened to daylight, the storm had buried fences and wagons alike. The survivors climbed out one by one. Their cabins stood, but many were frozen inside and unlivable. The small chamber beneath Jonah's floor had kept them alive. No one in Crow's Fork Basin joked about the hole again. Spring uncovered the basin slowly. Snow receded from fences and wagon paths first, then from rooftops and fields. Families returned to their homes to assess what remained usable. Many cabins still stood upright, yet inside they were frozen solid. Furniture cracked. Water barrels split. Food spoiled in locked cupboards. People remembered where they had spent those 5 days. One by one, homesteaders came to Jonah Kearns with questions. Not praise, not celebration. Practical questions. How deep had he dug? How wide should the room be? What kind of mortar held best against moisture? Jonah answered each plainly. He lent tools when asked. He showed how to seal a hatch and how to set a vent within a chimney. He never called the design his invention. He described it as arrangement rather than discovery. He insisted the earth itself did the work. By the next winter, 2 nearby cabins had built similar chambers. They were not identical. Each man adjusted details to his own structure, but all shared the same principle. The work spread without announcement. Travelers passing through the basin noticed little difference from the road. No monuments marked the change. No plaque carried a name. Years later, a heavy storm collapsed Jonah's aging cabin roof after a long thaw and refreeze. Neighbors came to help clear the damage. They expected to find the lower room filled with debris. The beams above had fallen inward. The chimney stones had scattered. But the chamber beneath remained intact. Its brick walls held firm. The hatch frame stayed square. The air below felt steady as ever. Men stood quietly inside it, remembering the winter when they had waited there together. No one spoke of credit. They spoke of preparation. Jonah rebuilt a smaller house nearby and lived out his years repairing tools and wagon parts as before. He never claimed to have outsmarted the storm. He had only learned where not to fight it. On the frontier, pride rarely preserved life. Understanding did. The lesson endured longer than the cabin. A shelter succeeds not by resisting nature, but by working with it. If you had faced that blizzard, would you have trusted a hidden room beneath the floor or stayed by the fireplace? Tell us in the comments.